guys, welcome to this next episode of Ashley's Digital China. Today we have another phenomenal guest, Bill Russo, who is a Shanghai-based founder and CEO of Automobility Limited, an advisory firm helping build the future of mobility. He was formerly the head of Chrysler's business in Northeast Asia. Bill has over 40 years of experience and 20 of which were in China and Asia. Bill, welcome on the show.
Thank you, Ashley. Wonderful to be here.
Fantastic to have you as well. And to start with, could you tell us a bit more about yourself and this journey that you've had in Asia and generally in the industry? What sparked your interest to actually start out in this automobile and mobility sector?
Well, it is a long journey, as I think you alluded to, 40 years professional career. Didn't start out in automotive, began in all things in the information technology area. And what's interesting is it's come like full circle as the auto industry goes through this era of digital disruption, really the whole transformation, I think, of an industry business model. And it was helpful to start my career at IBM, who went through an era of digital disruption. You know, the computer giant, a hardware-based business, a centralized computer architecture, that whole industry has been transformed by waves of successive innovations. My career early days was making chips that went into the personal computer. The PC era was the first revolution. If you would think of the information technology revolution, it was the disruption of the paradigm of centralized computing, the whole distributed computing architecture, democratization of information is what happened in the 1980s and 1990s as computing moved to smaller devices, got connected through the internet, and eventually evolved into the form factors that we see today, with portable devices that we carry around with access to the universe of information. And now with AI coming on board, a whole revolution in information technology, making the power of the internet really connecting all of the human beings on the planet in ways that they never were before. I pivoted from IBM, moved to Detroit in the late 1980s, started working then initially with IBM for an automotive company, Chrysler. During that time, I was an advisor consultant on business process related technology implementations. Worked my way into a role where I was part of the Daimler Chrysler merger integration activity, evolved from that role into a role where I was the head of corporate, it was business, product and business strategy within the Chrysler Group. And it was after a series of moves there, I ended up leading a project that brought me to China 21 years ago initially, where we were scouting for the next growth opportunity. And who'd have known at that time that China wouldn't just become, back then, at the turn of this century, China was about a 1 million unit automotive market. It grew rapidly to about 3 million units when I moved here in 2004. And today stands at 1/3 of all the cars produced in the world are made in China. But it's also the world's biggest digital economy. And it's over that period of time in the last decade that China has brought a whole new paradigm into the automotive industry business model. 10 years ago, we started to see the democratization of the access to the utility of the automotive industry. The utility of the automotive industry is mobility, right? We choose to purchase, own, and our cars because it gives us the freedom of individual mobility. That was a form of democratizing mobility, which prior to that was mostly done through public transportation, through means of devices that we didn't individually have access to. In China, buying cars only evolved rapidly in the last 20 years, but in the last 10, the internet economy embraced this idea of on-demand mobility, and that brought a wave of investment coming from China's internet economy. And China's internet economy was born in the mobile era, right? Most people, more than 1 billion people in China, have access to the internet, and their primary way of accessing the internet is through a mobile device. They didn't evolve through the eras of central computing, desktop computing, personal computing, leading to the consumption of internet services through mobile devices. That was the way the world outside of China evolved. China's internet economy was born mobile, really grew up around and scaled around the mobile device. And when you started to put apps in people's hands that allowed them to call a car when they needed it, or to order food that invoked a mobility device bringing services to you, it really sparked a wave of entry of digital companies into the ecosystem or into the value chain of this industry. And that's been a transformative force that we haven't seen the likes of anywhere else in the world. So it's been sort of an interesting journey because I've come full circle. I watched PC revolution really change and disrupt the traditional computing industry. And now I'm watching in a very analogous way the transformation of a very traditional automotive industry through the likes of similar technologies, digital technology.
Oh, this is indeed a fascinating journey. And as you said, mobility, very often when people think automobile mobility, they still think about person moving in space. But mobility, in fact, today also incorporates a lot of logistics, a lot of last mile delivery. It's about the
Right.
flow of everything physical in the world
Right.
to meet the demand of that person. And that's where you've mentioned China is unmatched when it comes to obviously those digital ecosystems that can
Right.
coordinate effectively such a flow. So you've seen it evolved over the past 21 years, but in particular the last 10 years, becoming such an important, again, market and also innovator. And right now, aiming to take the globe. So what are the key drivers beyond just the fact that China is mobile first? But what are the key drivers for this transformation of China 20 years back and today?
Yeah, well, first of all, if you think of what made China a candidate for being able to do this, first of all, large population. Demand for mobility is a function of human activity, right? Our need to be mobile, not just because we want to move around. It's just the way the economy works. If I think of what is mobility is the circulatory system of the economy.
Yeah.
It's us moving to places. It's us moving between the places we live, work, and play. It's us moving to things moving to us, right? People and goods movement is really the lifeblood of the economy. And that also is involving services, right? You know, us going to places to be served, services coming to us, right? And that could be medical services, that could be first responders, that could be, you know, anything that involves things having to be transported. China's paradigm for how to solve the mobility problem was evolved later. It was a nation that developed in the late 20th century and did not develop quickly. It was slow in evolution. It came out of the World War II decimated nation. It was a country that had to rebuild itself from the ground up. And it took decades to kind of shed itself of the early stages of the Communist Revolution to what it became in the post-Tiananmen, Deng Xiaoping-led opening of China. And that period of time brought a whole lot of change in terms of both people's lives and expectations of what they can achieve in their life. It didn't happen right away. It was a slow and evolution of development. But when the industry really opened, the floodgates of investment really opened up was in the post-2001 WTO accession. That's when foreign investment came. That's when, the whole rebirth, if you will, of the Chinese economy really, sprouted from the seeds that were planted there. And I came shortly after that. I came in 2004. I was then with Chrysler, was part of Daimler Chrysler. I headed up the Northeast Asia business for that company. And I watched this industry grow from then. At the time I came here, it's about 3 million units a year to over 30 million at its peak in 2017. But the fortunate thing for me is I stepped out of being inside the industry to going back to my technology and consulting roots. My view of the industry shifted from being inside the automotive company to being an advisor to automotive clients and seeing the world not through the lens of just my slice of the automotive industry responsibility, which was helping grow my business when I was part of the corporation, but to really understanding the whole technology revolution that was happening and why it was sort of a more open field for innovation than the rest of the world. When you're in an industry that has a 100+ year history, you have sort of this multi-generational view of the way it works. And you have a dominant culture, both national and corporate culture, that values a certain set of capabilities that you tend to hold as being true and true forever. And I was familiar with that because I knew that was one of the challenges that the previous company I worked for, IBM, had faced. They had this view of the computing revolution as being theirs. They owned it. They determined the rate at which it happened. And then things changed when Steve Jobs and Apple and the personal computer revolution, Bill Gates and Microsoft, the whole, turning the industry business model upside down happened. And that's because the industry then, computing industry I'm talking about, was being radically restructured because of the technology revolution. The miniaturization of the chipsets, the creation of smaller form factor devices, the opening of the whole app-based ecosystems around the mobile device. All of that happened. It's happening now in the automotive industry, but it's happening in China, the world's biggest, not only automobile market, the world's biggest population, world's biggest automobile market, because more people are moving, more things are moving to people, more mobility happens here. And it has the world's biggest digital economy. It's got a digital economy that was born around the mobile device. The app-based ecosystems that dispense the services which involve mobility are far more ubiquitous in the way they're deployed, and it creates a whole new playing field of competition that doesn't favor the hardware company. It favors the more digitally oriented services company.
And this is indeed very difficult to replicate. There are so many companies around the world right now looking at the rapid rise of China's new energy vehicles, or in general electronic vehicle market, and they come to China at times and think that they could capture that one golden tip or rule or formula that they could bring home. And indeed, we need to learn from China, both from successes and failures, of course, but it's very difficult to replicate that level of advancement and success because the environment is so different. So looking at this new energy vehicles and electric vehicles, where is China going with this? The world is very nervous. Has the train departed and they're dominating the industry globally, or is there hope still?
Well, first of all, are you nervous because you're not up to the task at hand? You got to fight for your right to be in the lead. I always like to say that mobility innovation has been the mile marker for the advancement of civilization, right? When we think of the leading economies of the world, go back in history and look at who are the leading economies of the world. It was initially those who harnessed the power of wind and were able to conquer the sea. It was those who were able to open up commerce on land through canal systems. If you were the Netherlands, if you were sort of age of discovery leader, it was because you were able to build seafaring vessels to move people, move things around the world. Go through the sort of the industrial revolution. It was to be able to transportation of goods to a place where it could be manufactured in a factory, harnessing energy in a way that mechanized production. That was initially happening in Europe. It's migrated around the world. The Western world dominated the economic development of everything up through the 20th century. The 20th century mobility innovation economy was the United States. It wasn't because it invented the car. It's because it applied mass production techniques. Thank you, Henry Ford, and the Model T apply mass production techniques to democratize the affordability of individual transportation. With the assistance of support from the whole ecosystem, the building of a nationwide road system and rail system. Let's not forget the fact that the transcontinental railroad built by a lot of Chinese immigrant workers was the thing that tied the west and east coast of the United States together. The Wright brothers and the commercialization of the invention and the commercialization of air travel, space travel, all of that. U.S. was the leading economy of the 20th century, not coincidentally because its ability to secure the supply of oil, innovate around mobility devices, do all the things that creates the economic leadership that it had. And I do say had because since the late 20th century, the power has shifted to East Asia, initially with the rise of the Japanese and Korean automakers. If I think of this automotive industry back to 1950, the United States produced more than 3/4, over 75% of the world's automobiles in 1950. Today, China produces almost 1 out of every 3 cars that are made in the world are made in China. The U.S. produces a fraction of that. Japan, once upon a time in the 1990 era, had surpassed the United States in terms of its production. A lot of things were being made in Japan in 1990. So the powers have shifted to the markets that can aggregate and produce efficiently the machines that transport us. But the thing that China has done in the 21st century is it started out just being bigger, and that was a gravitational pull for everyone to build up the infrastructure that we now have for producing automobiles. But what it did is it invested in modern roadway systems, modern rail. They got high-speed rail, deployed massively. They didn't invent it, but they mass commercialized high-speed rail. They grew to being the largest car market in the world by 2009. It's by far the largest not only automotive consumer, it's 29% of the global sales of automobiles. It's 32% of the world's production of automobiles. And in the EV era, it produces two-thirds, about 64% of the world's electric vehicles, and produces more than 70% of the world's EV batteries. How did that happen? How did we go from 1950 to 2024, 74 years, to where the U.S. had 76% of the world's automobile production, to where now today China has almost one third? It's this recognition that the automotive, or I'd say the transportation sector, the mobility sector, is the engine of economic advancement. And it's recognition on top of that, that the innovation around mobility is a high-tech tailwind to the economic development of the country. That's the failure, I think, of the Western world, is it's a failure to recognize that the automotive industry is not a Rust Belt industry. It's not a traditional manufacturing only industry. It's still a very important manufacturing industrial sector, but it's also a high-tech sector. Why is it a high-tech sector? Because the car is the biggest computer that you're going to interact with on an everyday basis. It has the vast ability to aggregate data around our mobility pattern, around our consumption pattern, and it is the circulatory system of the economy. If you can turn that analog device driven by a driver into a digital device that serves the user, then you have an amazing ability to be the leading innovative economy of the world. China recognized that early, invested in it, and the rest of the world is now trying to catch up.
And this directly links to the next question. Chinese innovators, Chinese companies, and Chinese digital ecosystem is very much not just customer focused, but I would even say human focused. It is human centricity, right? And very often they don't just produce a product or service and hope to test it out in the market, but they co-create along with the consumer. They are deeply connected with the expectations, they receive feedback, and they are able to quickly implement it and realize that. So how, in your view, are these Chinese consumers' preferences for mobility, their expectations, their purchasing behaviors are actually shaping the future of mobility today? And do you think these realities will actually have a more global impact as well on the whole industry going forward?
Well, I hope they do. I hope we don't put our heads in the sand, build a wall of tariff protections around the traditional industries and say, come and, live in our blanket of protection and go back to doing what you've been always doing, because that doesn't help to accelerate your company. It doesn't make you more competitive. Even if you can protect within your country, how are you going to protect the rest of the world, which is far more open to the types of innovations that are emanating from this part of the world? If democratization of services that are linked to mobility is something that's in demand, if making technology accessible and affordable, which is what democratization is all about. The whole information technology revolution was about taking something that was previously the purview of trained data professionals, right? You could only get information out of a computer if you knew how to program it, or if you were a systems programmer and you knew how to deal with the mainframe environment. The democratization of information is what made us all level the playing field for everyone. Everybody has access to the same information. You just have to know how to talk to an app or interact with an HMI. With AI, it's going to be, you just have a conversation with the machine and it'll give you the answers. Doing that today now with ChatGPT. We have amazing tools in our pocket. The democratization of mobility is what, again, was done in a different way by Henry Ford, by mass production and the physical world. The digital revolution, the information technology revolution in the mobility context is when we turn that which you can only access if you can afford to pay for a ride or pay for your own individually owned vehicle to one where it's level, it's available to everyone. You can choose to own, you don't have to, right? That innovation, that mindset of experimentation, that willingness to surrender the old and replace with the new has made it possible for this, I'd say, business model innovation that's emanated from China. China didn't invent the EV. It didn't invent the car. It didn't invent high-speed rail. It didn't invent any of that stuff. But it recognized the disruption, commercialized it at scale, and introduced it to an economy where most people had demand for mobility but couldn't initially couldn't afford it, or a minority of people couldn't afford it. By leveling the playing field, by making it mobility, democratizing it, by making it accessible into an urbanized population where lifestyles were fundamentally being upgraded by technology. Everybody uses a mobile device in China, everybody, and uses it in a far more fundamental way. They use it to order food every day. They don't use cash here anymore. And it's that commerce, it's that interactivity with the users of transactional services, all of which involve mobility. Think of the things we do every day. We move around. Everybody moves around every day. Everybody eats every day. Most people shop every day for purchases. All of that can be done in apps. And when you think of who are the big disruptors in the mobility landscape in China, it's the internet companies. It's the Xiaomi's of the world. It's the Huawei's of the world. It's the Alibabas and Tencents. The two companies that entered. Uber may have been the first app for mobility on demand globally, but the big mobility on demand companies in China were Tencent with an app called Kuaidi Dacha, and Didi with Didi, which is now Didi Chuxing, Didi Dacha. They both came out simultaneously. This is Alibaba with Didi and Tencent with Kuaidi. And then the two of those internet companies now serving mobility through an app merged and created the Didi giant mobility on demand company. And guess whom Alibaba and Tencent are now working with? They're working with Tencent's an investor in Neo. Alibaba's an investor in Xpeng. They're investing not only in the app to serve mobility, they're investing in building smart devices on wheels so that they can provide services to the users of the platform. This is the revolution that's happened. The information technology disintermediation of the primacy of the B2C relationship that the hardware company once enjoyed with the owner of the car. If you break the paradigm of I must own it to have access to it, if you break the paradigm, you can still choose to own it. You can own a car. If you want to own a car, buy a Neo or buy an Xpeng. If you want to access a car, here's my app, all of which involves transactional revenue to the internet company. That's a uniquely China developed, again, Uber may have invented the app-based access to mobility, but they never made a car and never will. So the idea of a technology company stepping in, disintermediating the primacy of the B2C relationship with the mobility consumer, that changed the whole equation as to how to think about the business model of mobility. It's no longer a hardware-based model. It's a model that's enabled by digital technology.
Absolutely. And when we talk about the hardware of that business model, it is also quite unique. Sometimes you look inside a Chinese electric vehicle and you see screens everywhere, and you feel that it's built in a way, as you said earlier, like a huge mobile phone. It directly connects with your mobile. It interacts in a different way. So it's not a car for driving. It is a space for enjoyment, shopping, and basically getting things done. So what is your take on the design of the hardware and how, with the help of Chinese consumers and those digital tech giants, the hardware is changing as well?
Yeah. When you when you think of the traditional manufacturing model, you build and sell hardware. Your growth and your profitability is determined by how many units are sold. Your business relationship with the customer is transactional and infrequent, right? You don't see that. You buy a car once every 5 to 7 years, but you move around every day, right? So the transactional relationship, again, this is the idea of the internet economy stepping in and owning a B2C relationship with a consumer of mobility. You want that customer consuming from you every day. Now, you're not going to sell a car every day, but that person's going to move around every day. And how are you going to interact with that person if you are the manufacturer of the device? Well, you have to think about it like Apple did, or how any smart device company thinks. By the way, many of those device companies in China are actually making cars now. Xiaomi, Huawei, big mobile companies with cars that actually are literally the embodiment of the smartphone on wheels. That's literally what they are. What does a smartphone have that an analog phone didn't have? Well, it's got a big HMI. It's a lot more sticky with app-based services that we tend to like to click on and stay engaged with. That's what you're going to find in a Chinese car. You're going to find it on the outside looks like a car. Didn't change all that much on that yet. That'll come later. The car on the outside looks like a car. The car on the inside is a moving living space, right? Because its purpose is to interact with the individuals in the car. All of them not just the driver. The Western paradigm is you buy a car for the driving experience. You prioritize the cockpit. You even use terms, if you're a supplier, if you're a car company, is the intelligent cockpit, right? You're trying to sell the idea that you own this plane. You're the pilot. In China, they're building the cabin experience, right? You're the passenger. You're the person who bought the plane ticket. You might own the plane, but you're not flying it, right? So every seat's got a screen, or it's got other creature comforts. It might have a refrigerator if you want to heat or cool a drink. I shouldn't say refrigerator. It's a thermal unit that can heat or cool a drink. Many Chinese cars have this. You've got massage seats. You got reclining seats. You got seats that swivel around so you can have a meeting. You might be able to pull down a screen. You won't necessarily only be presented with a plastic or a tray or transparent piece of glass. The car is going to be rich with HMI. The car is going to have digital features. And here's the thing that you're going to find very interesting. Go to a car show on a public day in China and watch how people and their families interact with cars. Children in China, all of whom grew up in the smart device era, look at a Western car that doesn't have this, and it's like a Teflon surface. You can't get a kid to stay in the car. It's boring. There's nothing to do. There's just glass, and there's just the seat back, and there's nothing for me to do. Get me out of this car. You put them in a Chinese car that has screens, that has things to do, and you can't get them out. You are never going to hear a child in a Chinese smart EV say to their parent, "Are we there yet?" When you get there, they're going to say, "Can I stay in the car?" Right? I can't get, you put an iPad in the hand of your child or a smartphone. Don't do that. But if you do, they don't want to give it up. That's the way they interact with the cars in China. And a family purchasing a car, it's the reason why in the span of just 3 years, right, since 2020, foreign brands had 64% share of the consumer sales of vehicles in China in 2020. Then turn the dial and the EVs start to take off. The smart EVs are now introduced into the population. And now in 2024, so far this year, 63% of cars sold in China are Chinese branded. More than 50% on a monthly basis now of those cars that are sold are locally branded. Our NEVs, our new energy vehicles, we're far more developed in terms of market acceptance of this technology here than anywhere else on the planet. And I would say that's mainly because the killer feature wasn't the EV. This is the misunderstanding that the rest of the world has, is they think that China went to a different place because of the EVs. What really happened was they introduced a smart device on wheels. That's the killer app. The killer app is the digital experience, not the fact that it's an EV. You can make an EV that doesn't have digital features and they won't buy it. Most of the foreign brand EVs are not selling well. And that includes Tesla, by the way. Tesla is a 6.3% market share company in China today. Everywhere else, US is 50%, and Europe is probably 30% of the EV market. In China, in the EV market, Tesla 6%. Why? Because they're not as digital at the core. They're tech, but they're not part of the ecosystems that have been built here around the digital economy.
Absolutely. And while we are talking about those ecosystems and those innovation powerhouses, what are the companies that you personally are watching? Both the big tech ecosystems, as you mentioned, Huawei, Alibaba, like who is doing a good job out of the big giants? And what about smaller startups? I mean, there are 30 plus new energy vehicles and electric vehicles and battery companies in China. Not all of them are likely going to succeed long term. So who are the local champions, big and small, that you are watching in this space, and why?
First of all, you could dismiss large majority share of most of the startups. There's a few good ones, but most of them are going to fail. Again, if I go back to my computer revolution, 80s and 90s, there's a lot of companies that came during that period that went away. There's a lot of internet companies that came and disappeared. The disruptors don't always win in the end, but they have a role to play. They change the paradigm. In some cases, they forced the elephant to start dancing. It was what my IBM days, my former the CEO who took over at IBM as I was leaving, going to the automotive industry, Lou Gerstner. He wrote a book about it because they hired him from a consulting firm. I think he was doing other things, but he had consulting training, and he took over the company and said, "We got to blow up the whole computing. Hardware is not the business anymore. It's the services that are ultimately going to be the end game." And he wrote a book called Teaching the Elephant to Dance. That's what we're talking about, is can you get this slow moving? You get an elephant moving, man, they can really move. They can be very fast. Don't get in the way. But they have to get motivated to do that. And I think that's what you're going to find is you need these disruptors. You need these little companies to come along. And some of them may become giants, but many of them will disappear. So I think we're going to see that happen in China as well. Unfortunately, the elephants are most of the traditional auto industry. I think of the industry grouping into two big categories. And I like to say there's lane one, which is the slow lane, which is your legacy car company that its business model is based on a hardware centric paradigm, a traditional B2C driver centric design. Then you've got this other lane, which I call the smart device or smart EV lane. These are the companies with digital DNA. These are companies that you don't have to teach them to be digital. They're born that way. They were born that way because they were invested by an internet giant. Let me name a few. NIO, invested by Tencent. XPeng, invested by Alibaba. Li Auto, invested by iQIYI, another Chinese internet platform company. There's the core, what I call smart EV companies, or what I just described. Those are the big three. Then there's the smart device companies who are pivoting from making some other type of smart device moving into the automobile. If there was the analogous company outside of China that was trying to do that, it was Apple, and then they stopped. They chose not to build the whole car. They chose to stick with just being the OS that you could through some interface connect to your car. But Apple's out being consideration when it comes to building the whole vehicle. But there are in China, the mobile phone companies didn't step out. They doubled down and they stayed in. Huawei, the biggest one. Huawei is a fully fledged all the way to the integrator of chips, software, and can make the whole vehicle. And they have brands, their own brand, Ito. They have other brands that they sell their solution and actually do the architecting of the vehicle. Those are brands called Stellato, Luxeed, built through third-party relationships with manufacturers. They call it the Huawei Intelligent Mobility Alliance, HIMA. And the core of that is Harmony, their operating system, right? The OS is the glue that holds the alliance together. Because when a consumer buys a smart vehicle, they're buying the digital ecosystem. They're buying into the digital ecosystem. And then the other one that just introduced their first car this year is Xiaomi. Xiaomi has the SU7. The SU7 looks like a Porsche on the outside, but it's a smart device on the inside. Priced at 300,000 RMB, which is under 40. It was about 40,000 US dollars, with a car that's really a fully fledged, interactive platform. Those are the smart device companies, what I call the lane two digital DNA companies. There are EV disruptors in China. The most noteworthy of them is BYD. But BYD is not a tech company at the core. BYD is a battery company at the core, not a digital native. So they're not a company. They're kind of like Tesla in a way, is that they're an aggregator of the battery supply chain. They came into existence to eventually make an EV, but along the way, they were making gasoline-powered vehicles, and now they have hybrids and EVs. But they're the leader by far in the market. They are the 21st century equivalent of Henry Ford. And the Ford democratizing and making the car affordable, BYD has the vertically integrated supply chain and has democratized and made the EV affordable. They can sell an EV for under 10,000 US dollars. They have a product called the BYD Seagull, which prices somewhere in the 70,000 RMB range. That's under 10,000 US. It's a world beater. If tariffs aside, if you have access to cars like BYD can make, people anywhere in the world would love to have them. They're well-engineered content, not cheap car. Very good content, very good value for the money. So this is what you have in China. You've got traditional car makers that have pivoted to EV, right? You've got some companies that are state-owned companies that are not shy about the fact that they're behind and are willing to embrace the EV. You've got some of these EV disruptors like BYD. You've got a few that are probably very weak. It's a market that, while it's big, isn't big enough to house this many children, right? There's just far too many companies chasing not enough customers. And that's the reason why I think we've got a consolidation that's likely to occur over the next several years.
Some of the criticism that we hear sometimes coming from both inside and outside of China is that, look how many players are there. These companies are not out there making money. They are surviving on government subsidies and hands out. This is not real business. This is not real revolution. It's all subsidized. What's your take on that?
There's some truth to that. China overinvests and has done that in multiple sectors. It's part of it's the way the system works. The policies are set at the federal level, at the central government level. They get deployed at the local level. There isn't one Detroit as there is in the United States, or in Germany, there's the three automotive centers, Stuttgart, Wolfsburg, and Munich. Here you've got virtually every tier one and tier two city with an automotive enterprise, ambition to be, you got 30 provinces. Not all of them have automotive companies, but more than half of them do. And sometimes within a province, there's more than one automotive enterprise. Anhui, one of the poorest Chinese provinces, has Wuhu, which is where Chery is. They have Hefei, which is where JAC is. So they got two big automotive companies. Guangzhou has Shenzhen, where BYD is. They've got Guangzhou Auto in Guangzhou. You're going to find it's an overly fragmented, and that comes from the origin of how the industry was built up here. It was a investment-led development, and that's not all because of government subsidies. It's because a whole lot of foreign companies came here and invested and built the infrastructure that today exists in China. It's foreign companies are in this market too, and they're part of the overcapacity problem. Everybody points to China and says, you built too many factories. Well, a lot of those were built by foreign companies, and they're struggling to justify why those factories should remain open in a market that is oversaturated. The other thing that's happened, which we didn't talk about, but I'll mention it here, is because of the way in which mobility is being served, the explosion in demand of on-demand mobility has flattened the curve of the growth of the individually owned car. We haven't seen a market of domestic sales that has topped 2017 since 2017. Peak car sales year in China was 2017, when about 29 million units were sold. Last year was 26. So it's been a bumpy, flat, slightly declining road since 2017. I would submit that's because of the on-demand segment has truncated some of the demand for individually owned cars. So if you can serve mobility more efficiently, guess what? You don't need as many cars, right? If one car can serve many people, then you don't need the same car to person ratio that exists in the West. In the US, you got like somewhere in the neighborhood of 800 cars per 1,000 people. In China, you've got maybe a third of that. So the bigger population, about the same, number of cars, and much more efficient model by which you can dispense the utility of this industry if you can create a different paradigm of how to serve transportation. But that also creates this structural problem that you tooled up to an industry that you anticipated to grow. It didn't grow to that level. It was supposed to be 35 to 40 million units by now. It's 26. So you've got a lot of overcapacity to produce cars that are no longer in demand. And worse, most of the capacity you installed was under the assumption that people were going to continue to buy gasoline-powered vehicles. More than half of people buying EVs now in China, which means if you were investing in building gasoline vehicles 5 to 7 years ago, EVs have only been scaling for 3 to 4 years. So if the assumption you made was going to continue to grow the capacity, the market would continue to grow, and there could still be a large lane of dominance for the combustion engine. Guess what? That didn't happen. So now you've got a huge overcapacity of gasoline powered vehicles and too many EV companies on top of that. So this is the problem structurally that China has. So there is truth to the complaint that you've got to rationalize, you've got to consolidate, you've got to take some of the overage out of the system.
Yeah. And do you think the market will correct it, or will the government stop investing?
It's China, so the government's going to try to have a hand in. There's certain too big to fail central government enterprises. They're not going away. Dongfeng, FAW, and Chang'an are central government invested companies. You've got large cities that bought their seat at the auto table. Shanghai Automotive, Guangzhou Auto, Beijing Auto, all the big tier one cities have big automotive enterprises, most of whom were profiting from the multinational brand joint ventures. And those are probably the ones that are most under distress right now because they didn't prioritize the EV or the digital future. So the market will ultimately determine which ones have the right to have a sustainable business model. But that won't prevent a guiding hand from the government from intervening to try to matchmake the consolidation design. It won't happen naturally. It won't be somebody buys somebody else because the shareholders demanded it or the market demanded it. It'll be an arranged marriage at some point in time.
Absolutely. And moving on to a slightly different topic, let's talk about sustainability. You have actually written a chapter in a book. The book is called Selling to China, Stories of Success, Failure, and Constant Change. The book came out just last year. And in that book, you discuss the race to sustainable future. So what, in your view, are the most prominent technologies or strategies that China is applying to reach its sustainable goal? Because again, mobility is such an important part of it.
Well, the first thing, is, and I debated what I'm going to call that chapter after I'd written it. I wrote it in a way that kind of chronicled this development of this industry from 40 years ago till now. It's a 40-year journey of really a standing start. The first Sino-foreign JVs came with Volkswagen and American Motors, the antecedent of Chrysler. Chrysler acquired AMC and took the JV of Beijing Jeep. That was the two first Sino-foreign JVs in China. But I took it from that point in time to present day, and I described it in these 4 chapters. And I realized that, I've been here for the most interesting part for the last 20 years when things really started to take off in size, and the disruptive nature of what's happened in the last decade since 2017, which was the 4th chapter of the 4. The 4th section of the 4-stage journey that I described there. And what is sustainable? First of all, your business has to be sustainable, right? You have to pivot to where the demand is. Sustainability is rooted in what makes the economic advancement of your civilization. So I start this whole chapter on mobility innovation has been the defining characteristic of the economic advancement of civilization, right? That's like your first principle. If you don't recognize mobility as being one of the key cornerstones of building a global leading economy, if you don't understand that that's your mandate, is to make sure that you're going to advance your civilization around mobility innovation, whether it's on road, on rail, in the air, or in space. Your ability to move goods, people, and, that's all rooted in your ability to harness the power of machines that allow you to do that. Machines that use sophisticated and advanced technology. And if there's a failure of the global auto industry, it's recognizing that the combustion engine-based mobility paradigm in the 21st century is an anachronism. An invention of the 19th century should not be powering the economic development of the 21st century, right? I mean, I can't underscore or state that any more emphatically than I already have. There is no business for this industry to be building its intellectual property moat around a technology that found its first implementation in this industry in the 1880s. You are an embarrassment to the world if you think that's going to continue for the next century. And that is the fundamental gap that I think exists. And anybody who looks now at China and says, oh, it's not fair, the government had their hand on the scale. Well, who built the rail systems? Who built the road systems? Who builds the infrastructure? The government has a role in this. You cannot criticize them for things that you should have done yourself. If you didn't have the vision of saying, I'm going to change the paradigm, then look in the mirror at who's guilty for that. National governments, protected industries that were relying on a century-plus long innovation and trying to protect them from a nation that recognized that its key to sustainable economic development was not relying on the oil and gas supply chain that was dominated by foreign nations. It was breaking the paradigm of energy dependency on the oil and gas economy that was the motivating force for China's investment in new energy vehicles. Now, you can then criticize China for, okay, the government shouldn't be doing that. That should be private industry. Well, Tesla owes its success to the People's Republic of California, because if it wasn't for ZEV mandates and it wasn't for government policies, there would be no Tesla today. That's truth. Every startup needs bootstrapping investors. And if the nation recognizes that mobility innovation is the core of what makes its economy sustainable, then it definitely should create the casino rules that allow the companies to win in the new game. If it wants to profit from a new energy transportation paradigm, then it needs to create infrastructure. That's not going to be the companies that build that. That's got to be assisted by the government. Infrastructure includes EV charging. It includes subsidies to R&D. It's putting in investment into the R&D infrastructure so that you can innovate around the battery, around innovations, around the new energy paradigm. It's even building the cloud-based or the telecommunications infrastructure. We've never criticized the government for putting up telephone poles or public utilities. There's a public public utility, right? The cloud-based infrastructure that surrounds the digital economy, a lot of that does come from government investments. Of course it does. It has to, right? The satellites that were put into space orbit that moved those switched packets of information, a lot of that came from government agencies that invested in the space program to hoist those ornaments into space. So, of course, we can't criticize a government for doing things that we should have done. We should have done them too. So what China recognized very early in this development is that the 19th century transportation propulsion paradigm should not be the way we win in the 21st century. We should not depend on the oil and gas supply chain forever. It is an energy dependent country when it comes to energy resources that involve oil and gas. Of course, you can now criticize them for saying, okay, isn't the energy that's going in the battery coming from coal burning fossil fuel energy generation factories? Yes, a lot of it is true, but it's our coal and we don't have to buy that from the Middle East. So there's an energy security choice that's made. I'd rather burn my own carbon-based stuff than burn somebody else's. And if I control the supply chain of whatever's replacing that, at some point in time, I'm going to be able to clean the grid. The energy management, the infrastructure. This is the part of the equation that I don't think the rest of the world has any real understanding of. We're still thinking of the EV and the supply chain as a physical thing. In China, the internet economy has a role in shaping the energy grid. The energy is a resource. It can be stored. It can be generated from clean sources. You need to invest in that. That's also, by the way, let's criticize right out of the box. That's also a lot of government intervention has to create that, right? Public utilities, right? If you're going to generate the energy, a lot of that's going to come from energy resources that are owned by public institutions. It's not all private. So clean energy has to be generated. It has to be distributed through the grid. It has to be stored. The way we burn and use energy today is we create it and we throw most of it away, right? In the clean energy economy, in the smart grid, we want to create it from clean resources. We want to store it so that when it's not being used, it can be used later. Right? Guess what can help you with that? Energy storage. Where are you going to get that? From batteries, maybe from EVs, maybe from energy storage systems. So part of the solution is putting that part of the puzzle piece together. You don't solve these things serially, one at a time. You do them in parallel. You develop the EV supply chain. You repower transportation around a electric propulsion technology, or as China likes to call it, new energy vehicle paradigm. And at the same time, you build the infrastructure at the local level and at the grid level. You have to think about in-vehicle electrification, around vehicle charging infrastructure, and beyond vehicle grid infrastructure. All of that has to be thought through as a simultaneous equations solution. And you can't rely on individual, it's not a bottom-up solution. You have to design it and have a policy that guides it at the national level if you're going to lead the 21st century.
Absolutely. And that orchestration and this coordination, I think, was a huge factor in China's digital rise, economic rise, and also plays a huge part in its future.
Right.
Because indeed, giving that very clear vision, where are we going? Who do we want to become? What problems are we tackling for the next 5 years, 10 years, 15 years? Creates clarity, creates accountability. Yes, creates a lot of, as we said, waste at times. But ultimately, as we can see over the past 30 years or more recently, 15 years, 10 years, 5 years, it does create results. So in that relation, when it comes to investments, be it investment trends by private enterprises or by government, what are you observing right now? Or where in the space of mobility are people putting money and effort? What kind of technology or innovation or infrastructure are they trying to build right now?
Yeah, I think what we see is, first of all, even before the EVs started to scale, the deployment of capital to invest in public and private charging infrastructure, that was happening even before people were buying EVs. There was a whole lot of charging stations that were installed, and really weren't a lot of people using them 10 years ago, but they were there. And it was actually, they called them zombie chargers in China because why are we allocating this space in parking facilities for EVs that people aren't buying? But that was anticipating that market was going to be eventually coming as the battery supply chain scaled, as the battery cost per kilowatt hour came down, which is generally what happens with technology. As you scale it, the cost structure, you get better at it, and then you drive the efficiencies to the level where it becomes economically viable. So that was the infrastructure downstream. There was investments in building up the material processing of the ingredients that went into the battery, choices made around battery chemistry so that prioritized price over performance, right? Because the key to commercialization is democratization. Affordability is what drives consumers to accept the product, at least the largest number of them. Not everybody wants the most affordable thing. Some people will buy the more expensive thing. But don't build your business around trickling down. That's gentrification, right? If I make it too expensive, then only the rich can own it, right? That's the way the Western commercialization path worked, is they didn't know if EVs were going to be accepted, so they put it on the trophy purchase, right? Even Tesla, when they started, it was a Roadster, it was a Model S. It wasn't a Model 3 and a Model Y, a more, mid-market positioned product until 10 years into their journey. China doesn't start with a paradigm of it's got to appeal to the rich first. It targets, how do I make it affordable first? You make it affordable the way Henry Ford did, by vertically integrating the supply chain and mass producing the products. So scaling the key ingredients that went into the EV was important, building the infrastructure to de-risk consumer purchase consideration. And the killer app, as I said earlier, the killer app wasn't all of that. It was make it in tune with the digital ubiquity of this world, right? If you make the car differentiated as a digital dispenser, as a user-centric design, then people are going to embrace it. And guess what? If you redefine premium as digital experience, then you can get some of that margin back. Right? All the things you had to give up in order to scale the physical hardware, when you add features that make it a more aspirational experience, then you can upsell that, right? The people who consume digital and really love it, they want the best screens, they want the best chipsets, they want to be able to brag to their friends, look at what my device does that yours doesn't. So Apple always kind of laughs about, put the Pro and the Plus model, and more people buy the Pro than the Plus, even though the Plus is cheaper. Because people like to brag about their tech, right? And that's what China really understood about the EV, is they're not buying it because it's an EV. That's the basic expectation. They're buying it because it's unlocking a whole new experience of mobility.
And right now, beyond all that, we see the rise of smart cities. And with the 6G on the horizon in 2030, we are likely going to see super smart cities as well. And autonomous vehicles and mobility is a big part of it, of course. So what is your vision? How do you envision the future of mobility and those urban environments in China and the global in general?
Yeah, it's interesting, as I talked about. I haven't put it in this framework, but let me explain how we see the framework evolving. There's really three waves of innovation. We experienced the first wave. I call that the 1.0 era of on-demand mobility. Why was that important? It didn't change the car fundamentally. It just changed the way we access it. And it brought a new species of investor into the automotive value chain, which is the digital app company that saw monetization of the transactional relationship as a way to create relevancy. Also gave them a high frequency use case that captured, at least in China. One of the motivations for the on-demand was getting the credit or the bank information card into the app. And the two biggest mobile payment platforms in China are WeChat and Alipay. WeChat comes from Tencent. Alipay is Alibaba. Tencent created Kuaidi. Ali created Didi. They merged. It was the mobile payment economy that was the killer app for the internet's entry into the automotive and mobility space. That was the 1.0 disruption. But that said, hey, I got a dumb device driven by a driver. Let me improve the efficiency of this by taking the inefficiency out. This is what the internet does. It sees the business of whatever the thing it is that they're embedded in. And it says, how do I make more people want to use it? And how do I increase the productivity of the device? Well, you do that. One of the ways you increase the productivity of the device is you make it less costly to operate. You do that by taking all the mechanically engineered things that break a lot and replace them with electronics. You do that by taking the combustion engine out, reducing the fuel cost, replacing it with an EV battery. Cheaper to operate, less replacement parts, more efficient platform. Add other revenue generating features to it. Add HMI, add digital relevancy, turn the car into a moving living space. This is the 2.0 era. So the idea of the car as you can book it on demand was 1.0. 2.0 is add to it all of the additional revenue generation characteristics, reduce its cost of ownership and operation. This is what I call the smart EV era 2.0. And that S curve, the on-demand mobility S curve grew from 2014 to 2018, 19. From 2020 to 2025, the smart EV S curve is being scaled. Now beyond 2025, and we're already seeing the beginnings of it in today, with driver-assisted technology. The next wave is going to be the autonomous mobility on-demand era. I add on-demand because it's the way it's going to get deployed. It's going to be deployed not by people buying cars and donating them to the transportation sector, which is the way Tesla thinks it's going to go. They're going to be booking mobility on demand, whether it's booking an order to arrive at your door or it's booking a ride, but it's going to be done without a driver. And that's not going to happen overnight, but the beginning of it is already here. It's this, I'd say technology-enabled self-actuating vehicle. When it's designed, when I said it, the car in the early stage of on-demand mobility was a traditional looking car. We didn't change it all that much. The car's today starting to look different, but mostly on the inside. We're still retaining most of the outer appearance characteristics. This still looks like the car from 60 years ago. When you turn it into a machine that can self-actuate, then you're going to prioritize occupant space over the outer appearance. It's going to matter more what it looks like on the inside than on the outside. You're starting to see the beginnings of that already. But I think the future of mobility is going to be moving living space or moving experience centers or moving service dispensers. The cars are going to be designed to be self-actuating. They're going to be serviced in a different way. They're going to be deployed in a different way. They're going to be part of the infrastructure. So these are the things I think we're going to see. The third S curve, this 3.0 era, is what we're beginning to experience the early stages of already in China.
And this vision of the future is extremely exciting. And I also believe that there's no escape. The train has already departed. And all the companies that are not willing, or governments or consumers that are not willing to recognize that the train has left the station, are ultimately going to be shocked 5 to 10 years from now, arriving probably to this part of the world and seeing really what the future looks like. But for those professionals and businesses, companies, and maybe startups from around the world that want to engage in this Chinese automotive market and probably build that future of mobility both in China and outside, are there still opportunities? What can we learn? How can we participate? What can we do, right? If we are a traditional enterprise, we've missed the train has departed, we are right now in China. What do we do as a big company, as a small company, as a practitioner right now to make sure that we are part of this journey and we are on board of that train?
Well, you got to answer the question in two ways. The first question is, can they recover to what they once had in China? My answer to that question is probably not. There's no putting the toothpaste back in the tube. Right, you missed it. Is there a lane of relevancy for you remaining in China? Yeah, there's going to be a lane where it's going to be a smaller one, where some of the more, I'd say, legacy aspirational brands may still have relevancy. There'll be still, some of the premium cars purchased by, there's still horses used for transportation today, right? The legacy car industry is not going to go away. There's certain, but it's going to be much smaller in China. What I would do if I'm a global automaker, and I work with a lot of suppliers and automakers today and dealers from around the world. First of all, if you want to know that it's coming to your neighborhood, trust me, I work with a lot of dealers. They're really excited about they've all, here's the interesting thing about automotive dealers. They've all lived, these are usually family businesses. They're usually grandsons who had a father and a grandfather who owned an automotive dealership. And they've all heard the stories of how we survived because we went and got the Japanese brands into our showroom. We went and got, they pivot because they listen to the market and they know what consumers want to buy, and they will go and get whatever they want to buy, the ones who survive. And I got to tell you, it doesn't matter where I've been. I've been to many different countries this year. Australia, I'm going to Turkey in a week. I was in Denmark early this year, Italy, Mexico. Dealers from around the world want affordable technology, and China's got it. And if you don't want an EV because you don't have the infrastructure, they could sell you the hybrid or they could sell you the traditional car too. They're also affordable. So that being said, is there still relevancy to the global auto industry as it watches sort of a scenario unfold that's not favorable to them in China? The first thing I would say is, do you give up on China? If you give up on the world's biggest auto market, how can you claim to be a truly global company? And can you afford not to have access to the supply chain of the ingredients that are going into the next generation of technology? You should be here for supply, for minimum. Take a smaller share of the market, secure the supply chain at scale that China has that you don't. You need the batteries. You need the electronics. Apple isn't going to stop buying from China. They may move some things in some certain other places. They still need to be here. They know they have to build it in the world's biggest electronics supply chain. You're not going to build a fundamentally electronic automobile without some exposure to the world's biggest market for aggregating that supply. It's just, you're not going to be competitive if you don't have that. And I don't buy this idea that you can move some of that to Thailand. You can move some of it. Yeah, on a one-off basis, but none of those places have the scale of what China currently has. So for the time being, until you can find something bigger, nothing's going to be bigger than China. So you must have a presence here. That's why Tesla, even though they can't match the numbers they get in the US or Europe or anywhere else, they have to be happy with 6.5%. Maybe I'm a 5 to 10% player in China, but I don't withdraw because I need access to that supply chain. That's why you stay here. Accept your smaller size, access the technology supply chain that you must have in order to remain competitive globally. And the third reason you need to be here is that if you're not fighting the fight with the companies that are going to lead the revolution, you will not know how to defend yourself when they come to you, and they're coming to you. They're either going to come directly to your country or they're going to find a way through the back door to get to you, because they are not going to stay content with just making stuff in China. They'll build in Hungary, they'll build in Turkey, they'll build in Uzbekistan, they'll build in Bangkok. It doesn't matter. If made in China becomes the thing that we're trying to fight against, then China's going to come and make it everywhere else. The Japanese did. The Koreans did. Why wouldn't the Chinese do the same? They're going to find it it's a lot more difficult. So here's the thing that I would recommend to my client. Here's what I do recommend to my clients. What I say to the automotive industry is you must be here to be inspired by the innovations that are emanating from here. Because if you're not inspired by them, and if you're not learning to compete with them, you're going to be overwhelmed by them. You must learn to compete, at least at a marginal level, with the Chinese companies, because when they do show up in your market, and it may not be your home market. I said this to a group of Japanese folks from the auto industry, is you might think sacrificing your business in China is an acceptable decision. But what happens when the Chinese show up in Australia or in Southeast Asia, markets that you today dominate? What happens then? What are you going to do? You don't even know what you're going to be dealing with because you haven't competed with them head to head. So what you have to do is flip the script. You have to take what China has done, learn how they did it, and do it in reverse. If you don't want China coming in on terms that you haven't articulated, the thing that China did, and I describe it in my chapter of Selling to China, is that in order to sell to China, you needed to adapt to the rules of the way they play the game. And they required you to invest. They required you to put localization of your key component technologies. Don't let China come in purely on their own without any policy guidance. Require a JV if you think a JV is the right way to do it. Require an investment in a local facility. Form partnerships. Do things that get the technology and know-how and supply chain relevancy back to where we level the playing field again. And at the same time, out-innovate. Do whatever it is that replaces the current whatever hill they've climbed, climb higher. Go to a place where the market, if you're that good at being an innovator, then out-innovate them. But don't give your traditional industry, don't subsidize them with tariffs. It's not going to make them more competitive. There is not a single country example that I can point to where competitive advantage is rooted in trade protection. You don't get competitive advantage out of trade protection.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I love this. Fantastic insights. So what is your hope for the future? Looking at where China is, where the world is, where the industry is, what is your hope and vision that you truly believe we can or hope can arrive at?
Well, of course, I hope, having been in this industry for decades and being an American, I take a lot of pride in the history of this industry. I have a book behind me, Drive. It's really a chronicle of the history of the automotive industry, really made in America that became global. I hope we rediscover what made us truly the Western world. What made us the leaders that we were was our ability to innovate, and we still have that. We created all these great technologies. We have to learn to be able to embrace, not rely on traditional industries to be the pace setters for innovation. Usually, innovation happens out of a skunk works or an innovation lab somewhere outside of the boardrooms of major corporations. We've got to somehow get the innovative character to get from the incubator to the accelerator. And if it requires some level of top-down mandates, then so be it, whether that's at the state or the federal level. But the policymakers need to learn how the Chinese did this, right? Saying that the government should be completely out of the conversation is foolish, but they need to be in it with an attitude of learning from learning the new game, right? There's a new game that's being played. And if you're serious about the Paris agreements, if you're serious about climate change, if you're serious about forget about whether it's an environmental motivation or energy security or industrial competitiveness, you have to recognize that the transportation sector is one of the main drivers of the economic development of your country. And if you don't see that, if you think of this as a traditional manufacturing industry that needs to be protected, that it is in fact a high-tech industry that needs to drive the innovation of your economy. If you don't have that in your head, then get it in your head, because you're going to lose the 21st century to China because of it. I'm not here because I'm advocating for China. I'm trying to wake up the West to realize that you can't win by making them lose. Everybody loses. That's a Pyrrhic victory. If you think you're going to win by making China lose, then you've all lost, because you need some of what China's doing. You should be inspired by it. You should be collaborating with it on your terms. On your terms. That's flipping the script. That's writing the policies that allow you to get from China what you need to be competitive.
Absolutely. And recognizing that together we're building that future of humanity, in fact. And beyond just automotive and transportation sector, there are other sectors, from biotech to education to commerce to creation of new brands, right? New consumption brands, where China is, just as you described right now, with this example of mobility and automobile sectors, where China is indeed flipping the old script and creating something new. So while we already have this sector disrupted, there will be more. As we said, in medicine, there will be more in education. So prepare now, learn how to do it, so that, again, you can learn from successes and failures. You can prepare yourself for home, for what's to come. And together, ultimately, it's not one or the other, but together, collectively, as humans, we build a better world. I think this is a beautiful message to wrap up our conversation today. But Bill, last question that I want to ask you is really, what is one question that I should have asked you today, but I have not yet asked?
Wow. How do you create an experimental mindset to where you're willing to? I think the biggest failure of traditional industry is this attitude toward risk taking, that we leave it up to the private industries who have financial control systems that are about de-risking investments. Everything's got to be perfectly proven. The market has to tell you that it's the right thing to do. Don't take on risk. Experimentation is avoided. And that's what I've learned from China, if anything, in the 20 years. This is a very open to experimentation place. And that's not just an automotive observation. There's no staying stuck in the past and keep playing the old bet. That's why the book title, Selling to China, Stories of Success, Failure, and Constant Change. It's the constant change part that's really the most challenging and interesting thing about this place, is whatever you thought it was 5 years ago, it's different today. If you take a gap year in China and come back, you missed a whole lot. It's constantly reinventing itself. And if you think it's down, it's not going to be down for long, right? The idea of if this isn't working, try something else. We get stuck, and when something's not working, we keep doing the same thing over and over again and expecting this to change back to what worked once again. And that's just not the way it works anymore. This is a world in a technology era where things change so rapidly. Technology's only made it faster. It's only made the iterative cycles faster. We can do more in software now now. Therefore, we don't have to iterate as much in hardware. So it's a far different reality. China's the biggest market. It's the biggest digital economy, and it's got this experimental mindset. How do we capture that? How do we get that capability back into our system?
And this is the question with which we're going to leave you guys today. Think how we can do that. Bill, to wrap up, what kind of companies are you working with? Who are you helping with? What kind of problems? And what is the best way to get in touch with you?
Okay. We have two pillars of our business. One, we work with startups and try to help them with reaching out to the connections they need to make to get funded. So that's our investment advisory business. Those are global startups. Those aren't just startups that are working in China. We work with companies from the US, Israel, Europe, all around the world, including China. I happen to be in China because it gives us a window on the future, right? I like to think if this is a multi-act play, I'm in the second or third act, you're still in act one. So it gives you a hint as to where you might need to go. And it may not be in China, it may be somewhere else, but learn from this. So that's the one part of it. The other part of it is my advisory business, the consulting business. And our core demand right now is two main pillars: downstream dealers who want access to the technologies that are coming from China. Mentioned some of the countries that I've been to this year. We've got a heavy travel schedule over the next several months talking to downstream automotive dealers. I'm also working with energy supply chain companies. A lot of people want to know what's going on in China. We have probably a curated set of very current information and analysis that we provide to companies who want intel on what's happening in China. So that's part of our advisory services. And we work with a lot of suppliers who are trying to connect with the new ecosystems that are being built. How do I plug into the trends that we're observing in China so that we can bring some of those innovations back home and to China as well? How can we bring some of our capabilities that are still relevant in China? So those are our two core businesses: investment advisory with startups and core consultancy and advisory support for corporates. How do people reach me? LinkedIn, look up Bill Russo. You can go to our website, automobility.io as well. Thank you so much for the time, and hopefully this is of some value to your audience.
Thank you so much, Bill. Guys, fantastic. Hit Bill up on LinkedIn and do check out the links below this video. We're going to drop Bill's website as well. Thank you so much for your time today. We have learned so much. And what I loved about this conversation, that it wasn't just factual and insightful, it was fantastic storytelling. We were able to put these changes into perspective and see it in motion developing right now in front of our eyes. Thank you so much for this beautiful gift today, Bill. Guys, stay tuned for more Ashley's Digital China episode to come.